Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Kratzen, and I've been the curator at the David Winton Bell Gallery at Brown University for a little over a year. Before I introduce today's panel, I'd like to thank my colleagues from the Brown Arts Initiative, Sean Tavares and Gregory Picard, who will be running the Zoom tech today. Though this conversation is rooted in the years of work all of our panelists have done to promote a more equitable and just museum culture, and while I want to acknowledge Erin Christoval's first program in the Hammer Museum's Reimagining the Museum series on open letters and a decolonial framework, today's panel was specifically inspired by a letter that our moderator, Anni Pullagura, drafted with MFA Boston curator Michelle Millar-Fisher, Tufts curator Abigail Satinsky, and artist Anthony Romero. Titled Boston Arts for Black Lives and still available at that web address, this was, in a summer of institutional rhetoric and what is popularly known as virtue signaling, a letter that thoroughly yet pithily captured the intricacies of what an institution that was truly for Black lives and Indigenous lives and the lives of people of color would need to address to, as the letter aptly frames, remake itself. I felt moved to reach out to these three colleagues and begin to think through the potential programming that would help the many signatories and their affiliated arts institutions enact the 15 prompts identified in the letter. In a year of swiftly, sometimes rushed programming in response to the conditions of the pandemic, my impulse was to similarly program an ambitious fall series that addressed each prompt. While that is still possible under a different temporal framework, it was Annie who advised that I slow my programmatic thinking, and Michelle who suggested we look at the letter itself as a form of critique, as a list of demands, as accountability, and most significantly under-acknowledged, the letter as an act of love towards the idea of art and sometimes, though not always, the institutions that house and celebrate it. These are love letters, and all of our panelists today have penned letters that have significantly altered our understanding of our field. The intent of this program is to feature panelists in both junior and senior museum positions who wrote both solo or collaboratively, whose letters were made both public or internally circulated, and sometimes never published online. I want to thank Annie for generously agreeing to moderate today's panel, and all of our panelists for courageously agreeing to speak about these forms of resistance publicly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate, and welcome everyone to this panel. I'm really excited to be in conversation with everyone today, and I want to thank Kate for the organization and invitation to have this really thoughtful conversation that I hope will be very provocative and be one of many that I'm sure that we'll be continuing to address as members of this field and this industry. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce myself quite quickly. My name is Annie. I'm a curator and writer based in Boston. I want to give it over to my panelists right away and invite them each to share a little bit about themselves, introduce themselves, and offer some preliminary thoughts about this conversation of letter as form and protest. Kelli, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks, Annie. And thanks, Kate, for the invitation. It's really great, to be here in conversation with you all. For those who do not know me, I am Dr. Kelli Morgan, former Associate Curator of American Art at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, currently based in Atlanta. Independent scholar, curator, writer, advisor, doing a lot, wearing all of my hats simultaneously right now. And the one thing that I really want to touch on or really talk about today is the cause for resignation. It's like, as much as we've put out, in letters, I've had a lot, of time to kind of think about my own, and so many that have come out subsequently, to think about what does it mean, when we're advocating for the things that are so necessary, but not asking specifically for the people who are reluctant to do those things to resign.
My name is Tausif Noor, and again, I just want to thank everyone here, Kate, Annie, Indira, Kelli. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you all. And I am a critic, I am a curator, and I'm currently a PhD student at UC Berkeley. And I think one of the things that your invitation really prompted me to think about is really to put pressure on the term structural change that's been going around with institutions. I am very happy that that sort of phrase has entered the lexicon, but we can't let that be empty rhetoric. If we want structural change, you have to change the structure. And for me, that means paying people. That means paying all your interns. That means paying your fellows and paying them equitably. Because for all the talk that we can do, we know that money is really at the heart of these institutions. And I think it's really important that we think about structural change as something that we are committed to, and that we put pressure on these museums to make these positions equitable.
Hey, my name is Indira Abiskaroon. I just want to echo thanks again. It really is an honor to be on a panel with you all specifically, but to discuss something that I have been knee deep in since June, just thinking about the letter and specifically the community building aspect of it. I am currently an independent art historian plus, haven't figured out what the plus is yet, but was most recently a curatorial assistant at the Guggenheim, and a member of A Better Guggenheim, which started with a letter to our board back in June and has evolved into something much more. But really, what has struck me and what I hope we can get into today is the kind of connections these letters have led to, both within institutions that didn't exist before and also across institutions. I think we see a lot of similarities with our peers at different institutions, and really looking forward to digging into those similarities and why they're quite unfortunate, and yeah, hopeful for better for us all.
No, absolutely. And I think thank you so much for everyone's conversations and introductions. I think there's a lot to be discussed, and I know there's an eager conversation to be had. So why don't we just jump right on it? I think each of us has contributed to some type of letter form, a formal letter that was in response to the events that we've seen, not just this past year, but I think in our entire careers and even preceding them. I think we witnessed the deep need for change, the deep need for issues to be addressed that have impacted the founding of our field in museum work, whether in art museum or other types of museums. So I would love to have each of you just begin by offering thoughts about who were your audiences for the letters that you crafted, both the letters that were shared publicly in some cases, including my own, the one that me and my colleagues helped to co-write here in Boston. We discussed a lot about who our audiences were for the letter for Boston Arts Workers for Black Lives, and trying to understand who are we addressing. Is it an echo chamber? Is it direct superior supervisors, administration, boards? Is it our peers and people who might be like-minded but don't have the vocabulary to be able to just say what they want to say, and are waiting for our community to be able to do that work? So I'd love to hear from each of you. What does audience mean for your letters? Who you're thinking about? And how would you think about the impact that the letters might have in relationship to the audiences you were intending to reach, and maybe inadvertently reached as well?
For me, I think the audience, I always say that my curatorial practice centers people, first, and not objects. So for me, I think really starting out, the primary audience was just the general public, museum visitors, because I don't think a lot of people really know, one, how museums work, in general, and I didn't think that the public really knew what was actually happening, not just to, BIPOC, museum professionals, but just to museum professionals, period. It's like, I don't think people really know, how entrenched, sexism and racism and gender discrimination and class discrimination is, in these institutions. So it was one, to get that out, just to the public, to say, hey, like, here is what's actually, like, I know that people are super excited that there's a Black curator, at their institution in Indiana, as well as, even when I was in Philadelphia, but at the same time, it's like, here's kind of what's going on. The second audience, I would say, would be, the kind of powers that be, so the senior staff at IMA, definitely in June, where it was like, I wanted them to know that, like, I see you, I think a lot of times, the oppression, discrimination that is happening, happens because they feel like, again, directors, senior staffs, and even maybe, certain boards, right, feel like they can get away with it, right, because there's a culture of fear, there's a culture of silence, that I think we've all participated in at one point, in our careers. And it was like, no, I'm just not, this idea, that you can just do it, without any kind of repercussion, or at least without people knowing, that you're doing it. And that is very strategic, so I tried to lay it out, in my letter as best I could, or at least in the essay, from like its historical roots, and then how it kind of manifests itself, to say that this is by design. This is not like happenstance, just happens because you hired the curator of color, or even, the board member of color, you've courted in a particular way. Like, it didn't just start because we got here. This is something, that is very endemic to the field. So for that, I think those were like my two, like those were the impetus, that was my intention. I don't necessarily, I know it got through on the, in terms of the public audience side. I don't think it did much, in terms of senior staff, at either institution, but it was the outpouring, of, thanks, where people were literally just like, thank you for saying it, Kelli, was like enough, for me. I think a lot of times, we're dealing with something that's very deep. And so I've come to understand that disruption, is sometimes all we can really do is like kind of create the rupture. We may not be able to kind of change the world or change the institution. And so that disruption, that recognition, from public audiences, was really great.
I wanted to pick up on, thank you, Kelli, for saying that, because I really wanted to pick up on, in my context, which for a little bit of background, I was the Spiegel-Wilkes Curatorial Fellow at the ICA Philadelphia for 2.5 years. And it was toward the end of my time when the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were happening. And we felt that we really needed to respond. Now, what happened was that there was a public response from the ICA. It was on their Instagram, on their website. And we at the staff, POC staff members, but also just as a staff in general, we didn't think that was enough. We didn't feel that they had really addressed the issue, which was that police in this country are murdering Black people without any kind of retribution, without any kind of justice. So we wanted to call that out specifically. We weren't consulted. The letter just went out. And then, we were like, okay, there is this public-private divide, as Kelli was kind of saying. Like, we wanted to have a public response we wanted a better response that actually addressed what's happening at this country, which is anti-Black racism. That wasn't allowed. We weren't allowed to have that letter out. So what we did instead is, what we realized is this is actually a product of entrenched racism, anti-Black racism, and entrenched inequality in the museum. So that letter actually morphed into a letter to senior staff. So it wasn't actually just to the board or anything, it was to the staff that we work with day to day for their failure to recognize that, anti-Black racism is at the core of the museum. So when we made that sort of shift from that public to the private, it became a way for us it wasn't an airing of grievances. These are actually things that we discussed with senior staff for years. I mean, like literally years. And what we were demanding is a real timeline and real kind of action against the demands. We wanted for them to really take our concerns seriously and to take action against them in a timeline that would work, and that was sort of that public-private divide for us. And it was a way for us as staff to really voice our opinions, not just because we were angry about the museum, but the museum is a reflection of the larger anti-Black world. So that is kind of where I was coming from in helping to write that letter, which I wrote with my colleagues. And I'll be frank, like, it was difficult people were divided. Even between junior staff, we were divided on, what exactly to demand. But we did write that letter together, and we did make our demands really explicit. So I do think that understanding that sort of public-private nature of what goes on in institutions and who institutions are accountable for was really the sort of motivating aspect in thinking about audience for our letter.
We had a very similar experience at the Guggenheim, which I'm going to try to say in very plain terms, because really the lead up to the publishing of our letter was quite tangled. I don't know if everyone here knows this, but it certainly isn't part of the broader discussion or hasn't been in the press, but there was the version that is up right now was not the first version of this letter. The first version was an interdepartmental effort that had to be rewritten pretty thoroughly because of a certain set of events that led to the curatorial department sending out their own letter. So I think in terms of audience, with at least that first letter and what ultimately is online right now at abetterguggenheim.com, was the desired impact, because Tausif, like you said, the institution just had such an insufficient response to what was happening and was really using it. I mean, there were, in the letter, we call out this June 9th statement that's still on the Guggenheim website from the director. It was called, I think, A Message to Our Community. And it said, we grieve for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and I think it also mentioned Ahmaud Arbery, but then it was kind of a way to publicize this existing DEAI initiative that had existed for over a year and did nothing. Like it was a survey and a listening tour. And the survey, I can say, I felt very uncomfortable completing because it required you to put in your title and your background, and I was the only non-white curatorial assistant, so that's not very anonymous. So there was a level of distrust in the way the museum was handling this already. So on top of that, to have this June 9th statement, which was a week after they posted a Black Square, when Shadria Lebouvier called them out for the way the museum treated her, it was a very hypocritical thing to do, I think, in a lot of staff opinions, and the opinion of quite a few people publicly, I think, called them out on that. And even that was, I believe, a week after the protests had started. So it was the delay, and then to have what came out essentially be PR for this, it didn't quite sit well with staff. So, there was a desire for accountability for the way the museum had been treating BIPOC staff, and leadership was seen to be complicit in that treatment. So that led to the letter being addressed to the board. There was an understanding that the board wouldn't necessarily empathize with staff, but there was a thought that maybe they just don't know what's happening. And Kelly, to your point, an understanding that the public, they don't know how staff are treated in general. So I think that was the motivation for addressing this to the Board of Trustees. Something that was also a desired goal of this was solidarity with those at the museum who had experienced harm, current and former people who left, who left because of these issues, current staff who were still going through them, who felt they couldn't say anything. There's a real deep fear surrounding speaking to your experiences. We had heard of, people filing HR reports that never went anywhere. Either they were buried or the staff members were gaslit into thinking, it's not that bad. Nothing's actually happening here. And then there was also a part of staff who hadn't experienced those things. So it's getting them to understand what's actually happening. People weren't even able to talk to their colleagues. All of this happened. Like the reason this was so unprecedented at the Guggenheim was because of this HR roundtable, which I wasn't a part of. I was on furlough at the time. I was one of the 92 reported furloughed staff members. But from what I gather, HR had scheduled this roundtable where people in different departments were able to speak for the first time, and they realized, oh, this is not just happening to me, this is happening everywhere, and that's a problem. So there were all these different dynamics, and at the Guggenheim it's particularly stark because we're at different locations. Some people work at the museum, some people work downtown, and the people at the museum tend to be the frontline workers, tend to be most of the BIPOC staff at the museum. So all of these things intersect, and it was really very difficult and quite interesting to see how those dynamics played out and the need for building a community that didn't exist, you know, where people could feel safe talking about these things. So the audience for this letter is quite broad and included internal parties, included the public who had no idea all of this was happening, and possibly the press, you know, which I think we may get into a little later, and an unintentional part of that is art workers at different institutions. You know, I mean, as all of this unfolded, people were reaching out to us from all over the place, and we're saying, you know, we're going through this too, and it's really great to see you talking about it. We're going to talk about it. There were 2 other accounts, I believe at the Walters and Asia Society, who started A Better Blank, you know, like that was really interesting to see happen. Yeah.
No, thank you for raising that, because I'm one of the things that it has that I was reflecting on listening to everyone's conversations is the many forms that this letter is intended for, that it's not just for different audiences, that it was used in different ways, right? Each of the letters was, you know, a letter as strategy and as a tool of solidarity, as you were describing, Indira, in terms of being able to give voice to people who might not have had the tools to do so, and recognizing that these are struggles that are across many institutions, even outside the museum, and that, you know, our peer network institutions, other nonprofits or other peer industries. The letter is also as disruption, as you were talking about, Kelly. The letter can disrupt these kinds of, you know, these long-held ideas about the way things are supposed to work and the way things have always worked, and why would you want to change some things? Yeah, no workplace is perfect, but we're all trying our best kind of idea. And this letter, and especially the way you describe your approach to the essays that you had published and have, you know, what you've shared since, your experiences, Kelly, as disrupting that narrative of, you know, this is the best that we can do, or this is the best how we're all trying, so let's just give each other a break. And let's disrupting that idea and say, no, we can actually do something different, and we can create something else. And I think there's also 2 other things that we can kind of think about at the letter that I'd love to invite all of you to discuss, especially thinking about how these conversations, these, you know, controversies or scandals, however you want to describe them, how these moments of change are being reported outside the museum, where the letter is both a direct address to specific people, but also the letter as a form of public accountability. So I'd love for all of you to kind of think about how the letter, even when it had kind of straddled the public and the private, moved us into a form of being accountable to each other, and what that might be in terms of signatories, or in terms of how the letter circulated, who was involved. But I love to think about ideas of disruption, ideas of accountability, and ideas of the public, and about, you know, how we can keep these conversations sustained, and not just a performative way, but in a material way.
I think for me, it's been, it was really, you know, I always use the word serendipitous, you know, in terms of just how connected we all are, you know, as Indira, you know, was saying, right? Like the fact that it's happening, you know, like I said, it's so pervasive to everybody. And because for me, it was like, I felt like I was playing double dutch, you know, and I think I say that in the first, you know, paragraph of the letter, where it's like, I have stopped and started this thing, you know, like 30 times, you know, because of my own fear, you know, very literally, right? And I will never forget, I was, you know, when the kind of thought was like, you know, you need to kind of publish your resignation letter, because for me, you know, things had happened, you know, again, as in, you know, Indira and Tausif mentioned, you know, there were so many people who resigned before me, you know, because of these issues. So I kind of knew, you know, that like time was ticking, you know, that it was like, I was going to resign at some point, that I had to say something, you know, upon that resignation. And so it just kind of, it was like the universe, like helping me get my courage up, so it was like the essay came out first and then, posted on Change the Museum. It was like this gradual thing. But the essay really grew out of the first draft, of my resignation letter that I had wrote for myself and just kind of saved, and it was two things. It was like I had a friend in Detroit, who, alerted me to the Latina young lady, who resigned from DIA and, had published her resignation letter, on Medium, self-published. And I was like, oh my God, I've been kind of wrestling with doing that. And, he was like, you should totally do it. And then even in this conversation, actually reaching out to Tausif and saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing, would you mind reading it for me? Like, what do you think? And so we had a conversation. He helps me edit it, before I send it out. And so that the way that we are the public, in a very interesting way, I think the way that we do the work and the kind of whys, in terms of how we do the work too, is very much so connected, to the publics that we care about. So I've always considered myself to represent, particular BIPOC communities, particularly working class, communities. And I'm very adamant about, making space, right, for their stories to be told and their presence, to be had. But then writing the letter in a way of saying, the institution very deliberately works against that happening. So if that's the reality, what is this narrative of inclusivity as a core value that the Indianapolis Museum of Art, likes to tout when it does? What is this, conversation of diversity that like PAFA likes to trot out there? When it talks about those things, when the institution itself, is like working very deliberately to undermine, those staff, both Black and white, that are very literally doing that work, and so which public, because it's in my experience, you are not, as an institution, focused on the public that I very literally represent, that my colleagues, very literally represent. And so if that's the case, it's like, what are we even doing? So it was like making, trying to bring to fruition or to, I'd say maybe illuminate, is a better word, to illuminate the ways in which we, even as museum professionals, are also the public.
Right. And again, just to echo what Kelli was saying, is as Black, Indigenous, people of color working at museums, we're having these conversations with each other, right? Like we're already talking about what we've experienced. So in terms of taking that conversation into like a real institutional kind of change model and taking it to a public model, this is what I think the more interest in journalism has done. They have taken some of these private conversations into the public. I don't want it to get to the point where, people like Kelli are thinking they have to resign as their only option of change. Why should that be the case? So in our context, when I was working at the ICA, which I don't work there anymore, what we wanted to do for public accountability is have a timeline. We wanted to say, okay, here are the changes we're going to implement, and here's when we're going to change them. And we're going to make those implementations public. So it's published on our website. The goals that we have, they included the anti-racist bias training. They included more public kind of conversations from the community members in West Philadelphia, which is a majority Black population, into kind of what our responsibility as an institution was to them. So I do think that, like, in terms of what we insisted upon in terms of accountability was to make those goals public, and that's how we would do them. And as someone who doesn't work there anymore, but I still have friends and colleagues who do, I have been sort of just like, because I still live in Philly, like been following along with, what changes have been instituted. So I know that some things have changed, but like, I want to make it very, very clear that these are just stopgap fixes, right? These are just things that we're doing, but the ultimate goal is to change the institution entirely. And that means board members, that means our sources of funding, that means, not just the outward public facing things that journalism is aware of, but all the things that, we've experienced, from going to dinners and having, racist encounters with people who ask if, like, do we work here? Like, that kind of thing. That has to change. Every aspect of the institution that is embedded in racism and anti-Black racism has to change. So I want to be clear that all the things that we're talking about, these are just parts of a larger goal.
Just want to say I agree entirely with what you've both said. And in terms of changing the institution and how that relates to the need for accountability at the Guggenheim, and everything I say about the Guggenheim, I have to say, like, I've been laid off. So I do not know what's currently going on, but I know as recent as September, there was a huge divide, and I assume there still is a huge divide between those who agree with the need for public accountability and those who are upset that the museum's dirty laundry is being aired. They don't see it as necessary. They say, just deal with it internally. And I think what needs to be said is people have tried to deal with this internally. People have tried. The structures don't work. It's deliberate, and the parties who fall into those categories, that's a weird way to put it, but essentially the people who believe those different things, it tends to overlap with the people who have experienced these issues and have tried to take these steps, and those who haven't needed to necessarily, those who may conceive of these things as possible issues, but haven't had to confront them directly. And it's a pretty big gap between the two, and bridging that divide is something that I don't think has been done yet, and I don't necessarily know how to, but part of that is confronting what oversight is there. Internally, I don't see much, if any, and who holds the institutions accountable. I mean, A Better Guggenheim, I believe, had forwarded the communiques that it drafted to the AAM and received a very polite note back saying, we can't help with this, but this is what we're trying to do separately. So it seems, as an industry, there's a lot of work to be done to create those structures that people want to believe exist to help with these things. But what we have now is the public. And Kelly, I love what you said. We are the public. That is such a beautiful, that's so true. And I think this divide between public and private and the need to have these conversations happen behind closed doors, I don't think that needs to be the case. And I don't know how to convince colleagues who still think that's, I admire the optimism, but it's just, I think it also goes hand in hand with people who believe the imagination that goes into imagining a different institution. People see that as unrealistic instead of a possible future. I think all of those things do overlap with one another and are something that these letters try to grapple with, but letters on their own can't do that so much as just raise the issue and start the discussion that needs to happen.
No, absolutely. And I think this goes back to something that, Tausif, you've been kind of, saying and repeating quite often already in our conversation is this, and what you've raised earlier as well is this strange relationship between the gestural, the performative, the rhetorical, and the material, the structural, and the physical. Like, what does this look like? What does this mean? And I want to return to that in thinking about these letters, because the letters do certain work that I don't want to discount. As Kate mentioned in her introduction to our conversation, is that I think a lot of us we write to these institutions, or we write to we create these letters not out of pure antagonism, but it's out of a desire to see change. It's out of it. I would assume is good faith desire to want a better museum, a better institution, a better workplace. So to call them love letters, is one way to think about them, as a very radical, rooted type of love, a love that insists that things cannot persist the way they are, right? It's a love that demands accountability and it demands a change. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about the letter as a tool that is useful in the sense of having that rhetorical gesture, and that rhetorical gesture is powerful. It does resonate. It creates conversation. It gives voice. But its relationship to the structural, I think, is something that I really want to spend a little time on with three of you, and thinking about how does we translate the rhetorical into the material? What does that look like? Is it really as simple as changing hearts and minds through the letter, or what else is there? What else is there to be involved that doesn't end up, or that ideally would not end up always going the route of what Kelli had to experience and just simply resigning, although maybe that is what we have to do. And I'm not going to discount it. But at the same time, in the Boston Arts letter, or Boston Arts for Black Lives letter, I'm just going to read a short quote from it to help kind of frame this conversation. We wrote that as a living relic of empire, the museum as we know it exists because of its dependency on and complicity in the workings of settler colonialism and racial capitalism. To dismantle these systems requires nothing short of a transformation of social relations and a forwarding of a future founded on an anti-racist, abolitionist, and decolonial ethics of care. There is no place in such a future for the museum as we know it now. We must create another. So what does that other museum look like? What does that active creation look like? Maybe we can kind of think about what that would look like together.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, it was one of the reasons why I took the job, at IMA in the first place, because the staff, majority white staff, like any institution, facilities and, guest services is kind of, all Black. But in terms of, the museum staff beyond that, it was 96%, white. I think I was one of maybe 10, people of color, like across the board, in again, kind of mid-level, managerial positions. And I was astounded, during my soft interview, of meeting with so many different staff people, so many different managers who were already doing the work, in the best way that they could, as, middle class, working class white folks, in Indiana. I was totally amazed. I remember the first meeting with the docent corps, for the American collection, and, literally 30 middle-aged, kind of older white women that were like, Kelli, this is something we've been invested in. They had created their own tours, to talk about it. I mean, it had read Nicole Fleetwood and, had done their Google searches. And I was like, oh my God. But had said, we're middle-aged white women, so we didn't necessarily know if we should be having these conversations, if we're having them correctly, whatever. And I was like, more of you need to do this. Like, this is fascinating. This is great. So I wound up kind of working with primarily white women, who were already doing the work, and who felt that the work could go further, now that I was in the position, that I was in, that it was like, okay, well, now we have a woman of color, who kind of specializes in it, that will kind of get it over the hump, in a way that, I don't think senior staff, the board was really paying as close attention, right? Or as responsible attention. And then watching, it was like watching them watch the institution, respond negatively, to my pushing and even championing their work, right? And their positions and what was happening to them, because even the sexual harassment, right? Or I should say gender discrimination, because it wasn't, just to be more clear, because it wasn't literal sexual harassment, at least not that I know of, but definite gender discrimination. And it just deflated, I mean, just people just deflated, completely, because it was just like, oh my God, like we really thought, that this could happen. We really thought that the institution cared, right? And then I was, was quoting like Roxane Gay's work, like institutions are not designed to care, that is not what they're designed to do. So we have to find, another way around. And it was really discouraging, to a lot of faculty or a lot of staff, because it was like, myself and some of the other, staff of color, who were like really, again, coming into the positions and taking the work up, to kind of bolster, right, what they were already doing for years before we got there. It was like, now, right, we have enough, to kind of get it to kind of really, affect that structural change, that Tausif is talking about. And then it was like, nope, and not in the same thing, not like Indira was saying about the Guggenheim, not that it just didn't go anywhere, DEI training did start in September, so it was that, because that was like really the fight, from, way back last year, us just really fighting, seeing, because it was like every excuse, every backpedaling, throw it under the rug, kind of response, to just doing that, just literally doing that, implicit bias training, it was unbelievable, and just having staff kind of bombard HR, and bombard, senior management until it happened. But it didn't happen, until I resigned. It was like, that was the response. And then it was like, oh, the resignation is also part of the work. So, feeling a little bit better, about that. But, I just think it like we have to come at it, in various ways, various different levels, as much, as much as we can, there's no, I mean, and not that, anybody feels that way, that like there's one way, but it's like, it's one of those things that you just have to kind of keep hitting at. You know what I'm saying? It's like, kind of, I feel, the analogy of like chopping a tree down, even though that's not a really a great analogy, because it's like, who wants to chop down a tree for real? Just environmentally. But it's like, that kind of labor, where it's like, you just kind of have to keep beating at it, and it's as many different ways and as forcefully as we can.
Yeah, I completely agree with Kelly. It's a multi-pronged approach, and you have to get creative. Like, I mean, I'll just say this point blank. Like, I was only able to get my position at ICA because I had interned at the Whitney Museum. I was only able to intern at the Whitney Museum because it was the first time they had ever paid their summer interns. I couldn't do it otherwise. I couldn't afford to take it. So it's honestly that simple. Like, get creative with your budgets. I know we're in the middle of a pandemic. Everyone's getting cuts across the board. Get creative. Curators aren't using their travel budgets anymore. I know they got slashed, but like, if you still have a travel budget, divert it. Like it's actually quite simple in terms of what you have to do. And is you have to prioritize the people of color, the working class people, if you want actual change. It can't just be, board members' children taking up these positions. It's absolutely absurd that, we have to say things like that. But if that's what it's going to take to get people to listen, so be it. Like, get creative with your budgets, get creative with your shows, get creative with, the things that the day-to-day things that you have to do at the museum. Every single one of those things can be diverted into a way that is more equitable. So I think that's how structural change really happens.
I agree wholeheartedly. And something that's sticking in the front of my mind right now as you're talking about these issues is I think there's still such a resistance to believing that these are issues, certainly among leadership and unfortunately even among some colleagues and peers, just based on conversations I've had this summer. And something that I think these letters help us do is name the issues in plain terms and allow those who certainly know they exist to talk about them openly and try to come up with these solutions. And I think in terms of translating that to structural change, there's a lot of we hear you, but there's not a lot of actual listening to the people who are raising all of this. And something we included in our letter with the hope of getting staff in the room where decisions are made. And that, I know even saying it like that is speaking to a structural issue where it is hierarchical and kind of feeds into the top-down structure of how decisions are made. But we had asked for, staff to be allowed into executive cabinet meetings and to meet with the board with the hope of discussing long-term sustainable concrete action. And, that hasn't happened yet at the Guggenheim. But it was an effort to confront the fact that people in positions of power are still taking the approach of no comment. It's the belief that, they think or I don't know if they actually think this or if they say they just say this, but, it's only a few disgruntled people who are upset about all of this. It's not an actual issue, but it really is. And I think until people who have the privilege to speak in the museum without the fear of retaliation that keeps so many people quiet, until they start speaking up and until they start speaking up loudly and really leveraging that power, I think it's going to be really difficult because, that level of gaslighting is still a big problem.
Yeah, and just to, piggyback on that, as, for a real live example, right, where, it's something that I thought about that just came to me, with you saying that, Indira, just now that I haven't talked about in recent months, but, the thing that kind of set everything off, with my resignation in the essay, at IMA was, myself and 5 other colleagues, we sort of hijacked, a senior staff meeting, wrote a letter, to represent the staff's concern. And I'm telling this story because, like I said, I don't think this has been publicly, stated as of to this date, but, had a whole conversation, with the entire senior staff where we had laid out all of the ways, that the institution had been, just so bad, on these issues. It was the very next week, that then the IG, post and we stand in solidarity comes out, the director and I have our kind of back and forth about it because I was not mindful enough, or thoughtful enough, to kind of think about, prefacing the artists, or what the backlash was going to be. And it was like, no, actually, I totally did know. I just chose not to do it because I wanted the public to kind of hand you, to criticize you in the way that the criticism came. That was purposeful on my part. And it was like, so clearly, senior staff heard absolutely nothing that we said a week ago. So the disconnect, between like I said, what we're kind of demanding, or not kind of, right, what we've demanded across the board, to people who literally don't care. So as you were saying, Indira, hearing but not listening at all, because they literally don't. So then it's like, what does it mean when we're not asking these people to step down? Or demanding, right, for their resignations, right, instead of our own, or what, another thing that's come to mind is I've been, challenging myself to say, you're in somebody's house, you're in somebody else's house, telling them to paint their living room fuchsia, and it's a very kind of facetious, right, analogy. But it's been really helpful to me because it's yeah, can you really tell somebody else, what to do with their own things, so to speak, or in their own spaces? These were spaces that weren't designed for us in the first place. So do we go to the spaces that already exist, or do we build new spaces? I would love, right, to just eject them, from their spaces, as Annie, and reading, the Boston letter, suggests. It's these institutions, as we know them, they just cannot exist in this new future, this future that we're trying to build. And I don't think people are ready, right, to have a very real conversation, about what that means, even in the fact that means that to a certain degree, the collections themselves have to go. right? And and not to like, kind of get cart before the horse, but it's like we have to really, I think, be even more honest, in our resistance to it, right? Like even more honest with ourselves in terms of like what are we really asking for? Who are we really asking, right? Or demanding from? Like who are we actually talking to? Like we're talking to people that like, completely have no interest in what we're saying. And so it's like, can we really affect, structural change in that way?
I think that's a fantastic point, Kelli. And maybe as a way to kind of wrap up conversation, I wanted to raise, I think what I was thinking about when I was helping to write the letter was Kei-Wen Yang's, he writes in his book on decolonizing the university, which is a short text that's called A Third University is Possible. He's trying to address some of the conversations we're having about the museum, but thinking about it in terms of the museum, in terms of the university. What is the future of university that is truly decolonial? They offer a definition of decolonization that I think might be useful for us in thinking about structural change, thinking about the purpose and tools of the letter as one ways to address that. I know lots of conversations have been happening for decades about decolonizing the museum, and not to detract from that hard work altogether, but just throw it into this conversation in terms of the things that you were just naming, Kelli. I just wanted to read this definition from Professor Yang, where they write, decolonization is, put bluntly, the rematriation of land, the regeneration of relations, and the forwarding of Indigenous and Black and queer futures, a process that requires countering what power seems to be up to. And I think that last bit of that line and that definition, what power seems to be up to, and countering that seems to be at the heart of what we're trying to do with these letters and what we're trying to do with these discussions, is asking people who have power, and to be quite frank, all of us have power, right? We're all complicit in systems of oppression, and we're all complicit in different ways, as Professor Yang also writes. We're all just complicit in very different ways, and some are more complicit than others. And I think that's a truth that is really hard for a person who feels quite strongly or aligns themselves in a moral way with their workplace. And I think a lot of people who work in museums align themselves and identify themselves with art and with what art is supposed to do as a civic tool, as a tool for justice, and are just mortified, to be as frank as I could, that they could be withholding power or leveraging power against others. Because why would I do that? I work in a museum. Museums are about justice. Or our contemporary art is meant to, be the space of recognizing and addressing the things that, the world outside the museum doesn't want to talk about. So this idea of countering what power seems to be up to in the museum, I'd love to end with that proposition for the three of you. Of how do we counter what power seems to be up to? What does that require of us in terms of our relationships with each other, our relationships with our colleagues, our relationships with our supervisors, and our boards and trustees? How do we confront power in these spaces? And how does the letter exist as one tool, and what other ways that we can confront power in our spaces? And maybe that will be the kind of way that we all wrap up our conversation today.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's been grounding myself, in the sense of power in my own integrity, my own self-care, just like my own space. Because my work has been so much about, empowering people, right? Or empowering myself or empowering my colleagues, which is why I'm still, doing, talks like this. And I talk very candidly and very openly about it. So I will say, Indianapolis Museum of Art, or I will, name the institutions, and in certain cases, even name the directors, right? Because I need, and maybe I don't necessarily, well, I do need it, but maybe not literally, right? But I need, not just BIPOC museum professionals, but I need museum professionals across the board to understand that you can say no and be okay. You know what I'm saying? You can speak out about it, or speak out about what's happening to you personally or whatever, and be okay. I am doing so much better, than I was, in such a toxic space, and I think, again, like, being able to kind of empower oneself, to do that. It made me start, it really made me rethink, a lot of the ways that I've talked about my curatorial practice up until now, where it's like, well, oh no, the work, where you think, oh, exhibitions and acquisitions and fundraising. And it's like, no, the work for me has been space making, community building, and relationship building, and like I said, empowering people, that I just have done through, right, critical race curatorial analysis, right, or, a critical race approach, to art history. So as Tausif was saying, just these creative ways, to go about it, and how empowering, that is, right, how that is like my voice is my power, the decision to resign, to say, I don't need this, like this is cool. And, it's been nice. I do enjoy curatorial work, but no, like in terms of like, my foundation, just not to myself financially, but, even just career wise, it's like, I could literally go do some other shit, and that, kind of taking one's power back, and not feeling like, that we have to be reliant, in an interesting way, even in this COVID moment, right? Where like everything is, virtual now, it's like, you don't have to be reliant upon these institutions, we really don't. And then, so I'm starting to think about divestment, like what happens when we collectively say no, we collectively walk away, what do they have? Because when you look at the staffs, we do the work. They don't do the work. We talk all the time about, incompetent white male senior staff, and these, boards that are full of collectors who know nothing, who are surgeons or lawyers, right? Or business, like CEOs, and like really great in their own industries, right? But have no freaking idea, how museums actually work, and so it's like, yeah, what happens when we, just collectively say no, and so that's, my answer right now, to, how to respond to their power, or even just maybe not even a direct response to their power, right? But just asserting my own for once in my life, or once in my career, in a way that is beneficial to me, right? In a way that really centers me. And I think this is the first time I've ever really done that.
I mean, I can't echo that enough. Like collective refusal is the only way forward. And I want to, as we discuss the letter as a form, we know that the form has a history. And that history is actually in the history of labor. So when the art workers movement was happening in the 70s, in the US at least, that is something that we can look to. What we do in the museum is a form of labor. What we need to do as laborers is to organize collectively. So that can take the form of a union, that can take other kind of collective forms of refusal. But I think it's important to remember that not only are we not doing this, this isn't new, this isn't new, this has a history, this goes back, but also that what we are doing is not separate from what other people are doing all across the world in terms of refusing power, refusing capital, is to work collectively together. So, I think recognize what the letter can do as a form is also break that kind of siloed environment that so many museums have, where they insist that the curator's job is fundamentally different from that of someone at the frontline staff, is fundamentally different from that of someone working in development. That's what they want you to do. They want you to be separate and distinct and pit against one another. And I don't think that's the way forward. If that's what management and power is telling you to do, what you should do is the opposite. So again, what I fundamentally believe is having us work together, seeing the work that we do as labor, seeing something that should be compensated, that should be valued, and using that as a tool forward to collectively refuse what the museum's demands are.
I couldn't agree more. Annie, when you asked about power, I literally wrote down in my little notepad the power of the collective and the power of history, because those really, for me, are so core to this in terms of collective power, I think there has been and still is such a focus on individual power and accumulating that in a space where there's this construct of scarcity. You know, so little is available that the little that you are able to gain feels so valuable, even if it comes at, you know, at the risk of your colleagues, which I think at this point simply can't continue. We've seen the depth of harm that thinking has caused, and truly, I think, to speaking to your point about unions, like collective power is so strong, you know, and I think that change in thinking could really help transform this industry. And in terms of the power of history, Kelli, to borrow your phrase about making space, thinking of those who have made this space so we can have this conversation. You know, museums are not neutral, has been talking about these issues. Before that, something I only unfortunately learned about this summer, museums respond to Ferguson, you know, these same issues years ago, which if I'm not mistaken, started with an open letter, which is, I just found it. It's still available online. I highly recommend people read it because it really feels too familiar, you know, reading something like that from years ago. And as a former Guggenheim staff member, I have to mention Chedri Lebouvier, who created a lot of space for current and former Guggenheim staff to speak about the issues specific to that institution. There's a lot of gratitude to be had to those people. And I have to mention, I believe they are all run by Black women. You know, that's important to acknowledge. I also very quickly want to speak about the disempowerment that happens through silence. And the reason speaking up is so important, specifically those who can do so, like I said, without fear of retaliation, you know, not speaking for people, but speaking up when you acknowledge, when you see what's happening, and really lifting the voices of those who are speaking to their experience. I think that's a really big part of this that so far is largely absent and will be integral to how this continues to unfold.
Thank you, Indira. I think that's a fantastic note to conclude on, and thank you again for raising the work of the people who have created this space for us for so many years. I want to acknowledge that space and give them power to that space as well moving forward. And I think this idea of the collective is going to really be the critical tool that we'll need to continue to nurture and amongst ourselves. I'm thinking of that quote that I think that everyone almost knows now. I think it's been repeated so often, but thinking about how James Baldwin once said that if I love you, I'll make you conscious of the things that you don't see. So I think that's what the collective does, right? It is asking for those with power to look at what they don't see, to asking for that self-reflection, and then doing the work of taking that back and forcing that different perspective and creating new tools and structures for us to have the freedom that we deserve. So with that, I just want to thank each of you for your time and conversation, for all this wonderful points and discussions that you've raised. I'm sure that we'll continue to have and separately in our own circles and with each other. I want to thank Kate for organizing this invitation and this discussion space as well, and all of the staff at the Bell Gallery and the Brown Arts Initiative at Brown University. And again, I want to thank, as Indira pointed, again, all the people who came before us and the people who have made these spaces. This conversation would not have been possible without Latana Autry and so many others that came before as well.